3 years after losing his twin daughters in a tragic accident, a broken father believed he had nothing left to live for until one ordinary bus ride changed everything. He saw them singing, smiling, as if time had never taken them away. But the truth behind that moment would shatter not only his heart, but his entire world before the story even began. Let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from, and if you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. The wind had been chasing me all the way from the town of Dry Creek. A cold, restless thing that seemed to push me toward the 100 acres I'd just bought for less than the cost of a decent saddle. The prairie rolled out in every direction, endless and empty, yet the land felt like it was holding its breath. The sun had sunk low by the time I reached the weathered house in the middle of it all, its silhouette jagged against the pale smear of the sky. My horse was tired, and so was I, but as I swung down from the saddle, a strange unease crept into my bones. The porch boards groaned under my weight as though they'd been waiting too long for footsteps. My lantern's glow was weak, trembling in the wind, throwing quick shadows across warped planks and chipped paint. The brass doorknob was cold and rough in my palm, and when I pushed the door open, the hinges answered with a long, low creak that carried into the darkness inside. The air was stale and heavy, thick with dust and the smell of damp wood. My boots stirred the floor's grit, each step echoing too loudly in rooms stripped bare but not clean. The place was a graveyard of forgotten years. A torn curtain shifted in the draft, moving like it was pulled by a hand I couldn't see. The fireplace was cold, its black mouth yawning into the room. The lantern's light flickered, stretching shadows across walls that felt too close, and I realized the silence wasn't complete. Something moved above me. It was faint at first, the softest shift of weight on old boards. My heart tightened, my hand gripping the lantern's handle so hard my knuckles ached. Then it came again. Slow, deliberate steps from the second floor. Not the hurried shuffle of an animal, but the measured pace of someone who knew where they were going. I froze, the light swaying in my grasp. A shadow passed across the top of the stairs, tall, lean, and gone before I could breathe. It wasn't a trick of the lantern. Someone was here. And I remembered the man who'd sold me the land, Amos Burke, leaning across the table with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, telling me the house was empty. The weight of the stillness pressed down, but the sound above continued, steady and unhurried, until it stopped altogether. The boards overhead sighed once, then nothing. I stood there too long, listening to the way the wind clawed at the walls, half expecting that shadow to come back into view. My breath fogged in the air, and I realized the temperature had dropped sharply since stepping inside. When I finally climbed the stairs, every step groaned like it was giving away my position. The hallway above was darker than the rooms below, my lantern struggling to pierce it. The first room was empty, except for a trunk in the corner, its lid shut and dust piled thick across it. The second room's window had been cracked open, letting in a ribbon of night air sharp enough to cut skin. A narrow bed stood in the middle, sheets rumpled in a way dust couldn't explain. That's when I saw a pair of boots tucked half-hidden beneath the bed frame. Not mine. I backed out slowly, the lantern shaking in my grip, and made for the stairs. I didn't run. Not yet. But I felt eyes on my back, following me down. Outside, the wind had died completely. The land stretched silent under a sky where no stars shone. My horse shifted nervously at the fence, ears pricked toward the house. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, my rifle across my knees, watching the doorway. The lantern burned low, and in its weak light, the shadows seemed to pulse with each heartbeat. Sometime near dawn, I heard movement again, softer now, cautious, almost testing. Then a faint click of the back door closing. When I stepped outside, there were fresh tracks in the dirt, small, light, heading toward the hills beyond the property. A single strand of dark hair clung to the edge of the porch rail, caught in a splinter. Whoever she wasn't a drifter passing through. She'd been here. She'd been living here. And something told me she wasn't coming back for long, but she would return. The sun rose over the prairie, washing the land in gold, but the house behind me still held its shadows. I had come west to put distance between myself and the past, to find a place quiet enough for my ghosts to rest. But now I could feel it. This land had ghosts of its own, and they weren't ready to let me be. The prairie morning looked clean and honest under the rising sun, but the dirt still held the truth from the night before. Those small tracks cut across the yard, bending toward the low hills on the north edge of the property. They weren't hurried like someone fleeing for good, but careful, deliberate, like a person who knew where she was going and meant to come back. I'd seen enough in my time to know you can learn plenty from the way a trail is laid down. These prints belonged to someone light on their feet, the stride measured, almost graceful, not a child too long in the step, not a man too narrow in the heel. And the hair I'd found snagged on the porch rail? Long, dark, fine as horse mane. Whoever she was, she'd been staying here before I arrived. And judging by the bed upstairs, she'd been here long enough to make it her own. It wasn't my business. That's what I told myself while saddling my horse for a ride into town. I'd bought this land for a fresh start, not to get tangled in somebody else's trouble. Still, I kept my rifle laid across the saddle horn, eyes scanning the horizon the way a man does when he knows something's moving out there, even if he can't see it yet. The ride into Dry Creek was quiet, just the low hum of wind through the grass, and the creak of leather as my horse worked the trail. The town sat where the prairie met a bend in the river, a row of false front buildings staring down a dirt street scattered with wagons and the occasional stray dog. I didn't linger at the saloon or the general store, just picked up nails, lamp oil, and enough coffee to keep me through the week. On the way out, I caught sight of Amos Burke leaning in a doorway, hat pulled low against the sun. He tipped it at me, slow and deliberate, the same way he had when we struck the deal for the farm. "How's the place holding up?" he called, voice carrying easy over the distance. I told him it was standing fine, though the roof could use mending. He didn't ask about the tracks, and I didn't offer. But there was something in his look, a flicker too quick to pin down, that told me he knew more about that house than he'd said. The ride back took longer than it should have, not because of the distance, but because I kept scanning those hills to the north. Every ridge looked like it could hide a watcher. Every shadow in the grass felt too still. By the time I crested the last rise and the house came into view, the sun was leaning west, throwing the porch into deep shadow. I saw it then, a wisp of movement behind the torn curtain in the upstairs window. Quick, cautious, she'd come back. I didn't go in right away. Instead, I walked the fence line, pretending to check for breaks where cattle might push through, but keeping the house in the corner of my eye. The curtain moved again, slower this time, like she knew I'd seen her and didn't much care. When I finally stepped onto the porch, the boards gave that same low groan, the sound carrying through the doorway into the cool dark inside. The lantern from last night still sat on the table, the oil low but the wick trimmed neater than I'd left it. Upstairs, the bed was made. Not perfectly, the sheets were still worn thin and the quilt frayed at the edges, but made in the way someone does when they intend to sleep there again. The boots were gone from under the bed. In their place was a folded scrap of paper, yellowed and brittle, weighed down by a small, smooth river stone. I picked it up and read the single line scrawled across it. "Don't tell Amos you saw me." No signature, no explanation. But the hand that wrote it had a steady stroke, deliberate in its loops and lines. This wasn't a frantic plea. It was a warning from someone who'd already been living with danger long enough to know how to handle it. I should have left it at that. I should have walked out, gone back to mending fences and patching the roof, and ignored whatever storm she was dragging across my land. But that night, while I sat on the porch watching the last light bleed out of the sky, I saw movement again, not in the house, but along the northern ridge. 3 riders, dark against the fading gold, holding to the high ground like wolves watching a yard. They didn't come closer, didn't wave, just turned their horses and vanished into the low brush as the sun dipped below the horizon. Sleep didn't come easy after that. The wind picked up, rattling the loose boards, carrying with it the faint scent of rain from far off. I kept thinking about those riders, the way they'd studied the land, the way their silhouettes carried a kind of patience that comes from hunting. And I thought about the woman upstairs, whoever she was, and why Amos Burke's name was the one she didn't want mentioned. Near midnight, I heard the back door ease open. Bare feet on the kitchen floor. I stayed in my chair, breathing slow, listening. A faint rustle of fabric, the clink of a canteen being filled at the water pump just outside. Then the same door closing again. When I checked in the morning, there was a fresh set of tracks in the yard heading north again, toward those same hills. This time, the steps were quicker, the space between them longer. She was moving with purpose now. I followed them. The trail wound through knee-high grass, across a dry creek bed, and up into the scrub where the ground turned rocky. Here and there I found signs of her passing a bent stem, a small scuff where a boot heel had kicked loose a pebble. The air was still, the kind of stillness that makes your ears strain for any hint of sound. After half an hour, the trail ended at a narrow hollow tucked between two ridges. A small fire ring sat in the center, the ashes cold but scattered like they'd been doused in a hurry. Beside it lay an old saddlebag, half hidden under a tarp weighted with stones. Inside were a few strips of dried meat, a tin cup, and something wrapped in oilcloth. I unwrapped it just enough to see the edge of a folded map, the kind surveyors use, with lines and numbers drawn in a careful hand. It was old, but not worn from use, more like it had been kept safe, guarded. There was also a leather-bound ledger, its cover cracked, but the pages dry. I didn't open it all the way. Some things you can feel the weight of without reading a word. I wrapped it up again, exactly how I'd found it, and left it where it was. On the way back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed a line, stepped into something that was never meant to touch my life. The sky was clouding over now, the wind pushing hard from the west, bringing the smell of rain closer. And somewhere out there, I knew the riders had seen me. That night, thunder rolled over the plains, low and distant. I sat by the window, watching the lightning flash on the far horizon, and thought about the woman in my house, the riders on the ridge, and the way her trail kept leading toward trouble. I'd come here to escape mine, but trouble has a way of finding a man, especially in the West. The morning sun came up slow, spilling gold over the endless plains like a promise that didn't mean much anymore. I left town before the air could heat up, before the saloon doors started swinging for the day's first drinkers. My boots chewed into the dirt road with that steady crunch, and the only sound beside my own steps was the groan of my pack shifting against my shoulder. I kept my eyes forward, though I could feel the town's weight at my back. The memories of that sick native child and the hollow look in her grandfather's eyes rode with me, heavier than the pack itself. I didn't have few coins, some dried meat, my father's old knife, but I had something those men in town didn't. The will to carry a burden that wasn't mine. The trail out of Dry Creek bent toward the north, cutting through stretches of prairie where the grass swayed in slow waves under the wind. It looked peaceful from a distance, but I knew better. Those lands hid more than snakes. Outlaws liked to watch from far-off ridges, waiting for the kind of traveler who looked tired, alone, and worth robbing. I must have looked exactly like that. Around noon, the heat began pressing down, and the road turned into a shimmering ribbon. That's when I saw the black smudge of smoke against the horizon. At first, I thought it was a ranch fire dry grass catching from a stray spark, but as I walked closer, I could smell it. Not just wood, but something bitter, something human. The smoke led me to what used to be a small homestead. The house was nothing more than charred beams still hissing with heat. The ground around it was trampled into chaos hoofprints, boot marks, and stains in the dirt that didn't need guessing. A single wagon lay tipped on its side, one wheel missing, its bed scattered with broken crates. I stood there, letting the silence say what it wanted. The people who'd lived here were gone, either taken or buried in the fire's ash. The wind carried the acrid scent over me, and my stomach turned. I'd seen this before, in another place, another year. Raiders, most likely. Could be outlaws from the border, could be desperate men chasing food and coin. Either way, they left their message clear. Nothing here was safe. As I searched the wreckage, I found a trail leading away, a set of wagon tracks and horse prints cutting through the dirt toward the east. My boots itched to follow, but I stopped myself. Chasing armed men alone was just a quicker way to die. Still, I kept the direction in mind. Something told me the road I was on was already leading me toward them. By sundown, I reached a dry creek bed. The water had long gone, leaving only cracked mud and scattered bones from unlucky animals. I made camp against a cluster of rocks, lighting the smallest fire I could manage. The night came down hard and fast, and the wind in the grass sounded too much like whispers. It was some time past midnight when I heard them hooves, faint but closing in. I killed the fire and crouched low. Moonlight spilled silver across the ridge, and shapes appeared. 3 riders, moving slow, scanning the dark like wolves scenting prey. They weren't looking for me yet, but they were the kind of men who'd find trouble if it wasn't already there. I stayed still as they passed. One carried a long rifle across his saddle, another had a bandolier heavy with cartridges. The third rode with something slumped across the back of his horse. At first, I thought it was a sack, but as they drew closer, the moon caught on pale skin. It was a person small, limp, and unmoving. My jaw clenched. The image of the sick child in town came back to me, sharper than before. These men weren't just thieves. They were the kind who took whatever they wanted, land, goods, or lives. My hand found my father's knife without thinking, but I knew better than to step out then and there. 3 men, armed, in the open. It would have been suicide. I let them pass, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By dawn, I was already following their trail, my boots hitting the dirt in steady rhythm. The east road was rough, broken by dry gullies and thorn brush. Every so often, I'd find a dropped cartridge or a print in the dust, proof I was on the right path. By midday, the trail split. One branch went toward the rocky hills, the other deeper into the plains. I was ready to guess when I heard something faint wood creaking, a wheel turning slow. I crouched and moved through the brush until I saw it. An old wagon sat alone in a dip of land, the canvas roof torn and the back gate hanging open. Inside were crates marked with trade stamps, some cracked open to reveal rifles wrapped in oilcloth. This wasn't just stolen goods. It was enough firepower to supply a small army. Whoever these men were, they weren't acting alone. I felt a knot tighten in my gut. This was bigger than a few outlaws on the road. This was the kind of trouble that spread like fire through towns, through families, through everything it touched. The wind shifted, and I caught another sound, faint, strained breathing. I moved toward the noise, careful as I could. Behind the wagon, lying in the dirt with her hands bound, was a woman. She couldn't have been more than 20, her dress torn and her face streaked with dust and blood. Her eyes snapped open when she saw me, wide with fear, as if she couldn't decide whether I was another danger or her only chance. I raised a hand slowly, meaning to speak. But before I could, the crack of a rifle split the air. The shot kicked dirt near my feet, and I dove behind the wagon. Voices shouted from the ridge too, maybe 3 men, and the pounding of hooves followed. The fight I'd been trying to avoid had finally found me. I woke the next morning to the thin light of dawn spilling across my face, the kind that feels almost reluctant to touch the earth. The night had been restless, full of shallow dreams, where the fevered face of the native man kept surfacing through shadows and heat haze. Sometimes I'd see him holding his child, other times I'd see him alone, just standing in the middle of the plains, the wind tearing at his hair, his eyes fixed on me as if expecting an answer I didn't have. I sat up, the blanket stiff with cold, my bones still aching from the hard floor. Outside, the settlement was slow to wake, but I could already hear the crunch of boots on frozen dirt and the clink of buckets at the well. I had no real reason to be up so early. The ranch owner I worked for didn't expect me until mid-morning, but there was a pull in my chest that kept me from lying back down. The place where I'd seen him yesterday wasn't far, just past the smith shop and down toward the dried creek bed. My feet carried me there almost without thinking, but the man was gone. What was left was a scuff of footprints in the dust, and near them, a dark, faint stain that I hoped wasn't blood. The wind had already started to erase the signs of his being there, scattering grit over the marks, as though the land itself wanted to forget. I don't know why, But I stood there a long while, staring at the spot. Maybe it was the strangeness of how quickly a person can vanish from a place, leaving behind nothing but a memory and a few shallow impressions in the earth. Maybe it was the way the world seemed to move on without caring who was lost. The day ahead blurred by in a fog of half-hearted work. I moved hay bales from one side of the barn to the other, patched a fence rail that had been cracked by some restless colt, fetched water from the trough, all the while feeling like my mind was elsewhere back in that moment with the man's hollow eyes and the weight of his unspoken plea. By the time the sun dipped low, I'd decided I couldn't let it go. Not yet. I left the ranch without saying much, cutting across the fields where the grass had gone brittle from the drought. My boots stirred up little clouds of dust as I walked, following a trail I wasn't sure even existed. I didn't have a plan, just an image in my head of him stumbling away, maybe toward the hills or the tree line that cut against the horizon like a dark scar. It was near dusk when I found the first real sign. A piece of cloth, torn and snagged on a splinter of wood along an old fence. It was the same faded blue I remembered from the ragged shirt he wore. My heart kicked in my chest. I slipped it free, feeling the rough weave between my fingers. A little further on, I found him. He was sitting at the base of a half-dead cottonwood, his back slumped against the trunk, his breathing shallow. His skin looked grayer than before, and his lips were cracked. In his arms, wrapped in some kind of woven blanket, was the child, though I couldn't tell if the little one was sleeping or something worse. I stood there a moment, unsure if I was intruding on something sacred. The wind whispered through the brittle branches above us, and the sky had that strange copper tint that comes just before a storm. He saw me, and though his face didn't change much, there was something like recognition in his eyes. Not trust, not yet just recognition. I knelt down slowly, keeping my hands visible, the way you would with a skittish animal. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His eyes drifted toward the child, then back to me, and I understood. The fever. It was worse. I wanted to tell him I didn't have medicine, that I didn't have the power to change anything. But the words felt like an excuse, and excuses don't keep people alive. The settlement was a mile or two behind me, but I knew if I carried word back, they'd turn away again. Folks here didn't give help without a reason, and for people like him, no reason was ever good enough. So I did the only thing I could think of. I offered my canteen. He took it, and for a second, I saw the faintest break in that guarded expression. Not quite gratitude, but something close. He let the child sip first, then drank himself, careful not to waste a drop. The storm broke not long after a sudden wall of rain that came down hard, drumming against the earth and soaking us both through. But I didn't move. I sat there under that cottonwood with him, the cold seeping into my bones, knowing somehow this was the moment that would decide everything that came after. Because once you choose to stand still with someone like that, someone the world has already decided to ignore, you don't get to turn away anymore. The road ahead was no longer the kind of dusty trail that gave way under the weight of a lone rider's horse. It had turned into something quieter, heavier, almost as if the land itself was holding its breath. The hills sloped gently, but their silhouettes looked sharper in the fading light, like the edges of knives catching the sun before it vanished. I kept my eyes on the horizon, though my thoughts were still shackled to the moment I had left the town behind. The image of the native man's eyes, hollow yet burning with a final flicker of hope, haunted me more than the hunger in my own belly. I had no clear plan, only a gnawing sense that standing still would make me a part of the same rot that had claimed the town. Moving forward felt like the only way to keep from drowning in the stench of it all. My horse was tired, its breathing uneven, but I urged it on with the soft press of my heels. I wasn't sure if I was running towards something or away from everything. The land began to change. The air grew thinner, carrying with it the distant smell of pine resin and wet earth, though no rain had fallen for days. In the folds between the hills, dark shapes moved, deer, perhaps, or something less willing to be named. Every rustle made my hand twitch toward my rifle, but I knew the real dangers wore boots and smiled when they lied. Out here, the wilderness hid its cruelty behind shadows and silence. In town, cruelty was a performance, something folks applauded as long as it wasn't aimed at them. By nightfall, I came upon the remains of an old camp. A ring of stones still held the ghost of a fire, and scraps of canvas lay half-buried under the dirt, tattered and gnawed at by wind and time. I dismounted and let my horse drink from a nearby stream. The water was cold and tasted of metal, but it was clean enough to keep us moving. I didn't make a fire. The stars would be my only light, and the dark my only ally. Sleep came in fragments. My dreams were jagged, filled with the native man's face, shifting into others, my father, my mother, faces of strangers whose eyes still accused me of cowardice. Somewhere between waking and dreaming, I thought I heard the sound of footsteps in the grass. When I sat up, rifle in hand, the night was as still as stone. Only the sound of my own breath kept me company. Morning light crept slowly over the hills, painting the sky with pale gold. I mounted up again, muscles aching, and rode until the land opened into a valley. At its center was a cluster of buildings that looked like they had been dropped there without much thought. A saloon with faded lettering, a supply store leaning slightly to one side, and a church whose bell was missing. They all stood like relics of a promise that had never been kept. I didn't intend to stop, but hunger has a way of making decisions for a man. I tied my horse behind the store and stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and old wood, and the shelves were half empty. The man behind the counter didn't speak, just stared with a flat, measuring gaze that told me he was the kind who counted bullets before coins. I traded a small tin of tobacco I'd been saving for jerky and hardtack. As I left, I felt his eyes follow me like a shadow that had no right to exist. I didn't get far before I saw them. Two riders on the ridge above, their horses restless, their posture deliberate. They weren't here by chance. My first thought was bounty hunters, but they weren't the type. Their clothes were too clean, their hats too wide-brimmed for trail work. I slowed my horse just enough to make it seem like I hadn't noticed them, though every muscle in my body was bracing for the turn. The riders didn't follow right away. They lingered, as if to let me know they had the patience to wait. And that was worse than pursuit. Patience meant planning, and planning meant they already knew more about me than I wanted them to. By the time the sun began to drop again, I had put several miles between us, but unease gnawed at me like an unrelenting hunger. I found shelter beneath a cluster of cottonwoods, their leaves whispering in the wind like voices too faint to understand. My horse dozed, head low, but I stayed awake, watching the horizon through the branches. I thought of the native man's sick child, of the way mercy had been refused so easily, and I wondered if this land was cursed not by God, but by the people who claimed to own it. Sleep was thin again that night, and when it came, it brought no peace. I saw the town's main streets stretching out in both directions, but every door and window was boarded shut. The silence was thick, broken only by the sound of footsteps that weren't mine. When I turned, the figures in the dream had no faces, only hats pulled low and hands resting on gun belts. I woke before dawn, my body stiff, my resolve harder. Whatever waited ahead, I knew turning back would only deliver me into the jaws I'd escaped. The riders would come eventually, whether for me or for some message I carried without knowing. And in this land, messages were written in blood long before ink touched paper. So I rode on, the wind at my back and the weight of unseen eyes pressing against my shoulders. The valley narrowed into a canyon, its walls rising steep and jagged, shadows pooled at the base like black water. It felt like riding into a throat that might close at any moment. And maybe that's what it was, a narrowing of choices, a funnel towards something inevitable. Out here, a man didn't choose his fate so much as recognize it when it came riding up the trail toward him. I don't recall sleeping much after that night. The world outside my thin walls felt heavier than ever, as if the dust and heat had turned into a single solid weight pressing down on my chest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, Samuel, lying in the corner of my shed. his shallow breaths making the lantern light tremble. I didn't even know if he'd make it till morning. The wind had shifted overnight, bringing with it the smell of rain somewhere far to the west. But there would be no rain for us not here. Just the dry air that cut your throat when you swallowed, and the grit that worked its way into your teeth when you spoke. I left before dawn, my boots barely making a sound on the hard-packed earth. The town was still asleep, except for the drunks slumped in doorways and the dogs rooting through trash piles. My stomach was empty, but hunger had stopped bothering me. It was the worry that chewed me now. I was going to see Mr. Callahan, and Callahan wasn't the kind of man you visited without a reason strong enough to risk getting your bones broken for. He was the owner of half the freight wagons that came through this town and most of the men who drove them. If there was food, medicine, or coin moving anywhere in the county, it passed through his hands first. And I needed medicine for Samuel's boy before the fever took him for good. Callahan's place stood at the edge of town, a 2-story building with a wraparound porch that always smelled faintly of cigar smoke and spilled whiskey. The man himself was already up, sitting in a wicker chair like he owned the morning. His boots were polished, his vest crisp, and his eyes didn't match the smile on his mouth. "I hear you've been keeping company with one of those painted savages," he said before I'd even spoken a word. My jaw tightened. "His name's Samuel. His boy's dying." He laughed, a low, rolling sound that made my skin crawl. "And you think I should care? Maybe if he worked for me, maybe if he paid me, but he's got nothing. And nothing buys nothing." I wanted to turn around right there, but I stayed, because Samuel's boy didn't have time for pride. "I'll work it off," I said. "Whatever you need, fence mending, freight hauling, mucking stalls, I don't care." He studied me for a moment, leaning back in his chair. Then that smile of his got sharper. "There is something. A delivery that needs making quietly. No questions asked. You get it done. I'll see that your little friend gets what he needs." I didn't like the way he said "little friend," but I agreed, because I didn't have a choice. The job was simple enough on the surface. Take a small, locked wooden crate to a cabin 2 hours north of town. But the way Callahan's man handed it to me like it was something that might explode made my stomach twist. It was heavier than it looked, and it rattled faintly when I shifted it in my hands. I left town without another word, riding the old mule I'd borrowed from the blacksmith. The sun climbed higher, and with each mile the land grew quieter. No bird song, no rustle of wind in the grass. Just me, the mule, and that damned box. I kept thinking about Samuel's face when I'd slipped out before dawn. He hadn't asked where I was going. Maybe he already knew it was something dangerous. Men like him could smell trouble long before it showed itself. By the time I reached the cabin, the shadows were long and the air was cooler. The man who answered the door was broad-shouldered and scarred, with eyes like polished flint. He didn't say a word, just took the crate and shut the door in my face. I turned to leave, but before I'd gone 10 steps, I heard the faint sound of wood splintering and something alive, something small, making a muffled, desperate noise. I froze. My first thought was to go back, to pound on the door, demand an answer. But then I remembered Samuel's boy, burning up with fever, and how every hour counted. I rode back to town fast enough to raise blisters, my thoughts spinning so hard I barely noticed the ache in my legs. Callahan was waiting when I returned, leaning on the porch railing. He tossed me a small cloth sack. I caught it and felt the shape of glass bottles inside. "That should do the trick," he said. "Pleasure doing business." I didn't thank him. I just turned and walked away. But his voice followed me down the street. "Careful, boy. You start helping people like him, you'll find yourself on the wrong side of everyone else." By the time I reached the shed, Samuel was sitting up, cradling his son in his arms. The boy's skin was slick with sweat, his breathing ragged. I knelt, pulling the bottles from the sack, and for the first time in days, I saw hope flicker in Samuel's eyes. Still, that faint sound from the cabin wouldn't leave my head, and I knew deep in the pit of my gut that whatever I just delivered had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the kind of trouble you don't walk away from. I woke to the hollow sound of wind whistling through the broken slats of the cabin wall, the kind of sound that made the cold slip under your skin before you even sat up. My back ached from sleeping half upright in the old chair, and my neck was stiff from the way I'd slumped forward during the night. The fire had long since died, and the last bits of wood I'd had left were nothing but pale ash on the hearth. It took a moment for my mind to gather itself, to remember why I had stayed up so late, staring into the flames as if they might offer an answer. Then I saw her little sparrow curled on the cot with her knees pulled tight to her chest. Her breathing was shallow, each inhale sounding like it scraped along a ridge inside her lungs. Even in the dim light, her skin looked grayish, stretched too thin over bones that were never meant to bear so much weight of suffering. I'd done my best, wrapped her in every blanket I had, given her the last of the broth, but I couldn't shake the thought that it wasn't enough. Not for her. Not for the promise I'd made to the old man when I found him dying in the snow. The memory of that night returned sharp and unwelcome. His hand had gripped mine with surprising strength, his eyes burning through the shadows. He hadn't begged for himself, only for her. Take her where she will live. Don't let them. His voice had broken then, and whatever words he meant to finish with never came. I'd promised him anyway. I didn't know his name. Didn't know if anyone in this world would even care to remember it. But I knew the weight of a promise, and this one had settled into my bones like lead. The trouble was, promises didn't build shelter or cure sickness. They didn't feed a hungry child or keep a bounty hunter's bullet from finding your back. And that was the other shadow that had been stalking me since the town three men with eyes like butcher's knives, who had watched me when I walked away from the saloon. I'd seen their kind before, men who wore smiles like masks, all while measuring what you were worth in coin. I didn't know if they were after me or after her, but it hardly mattered. In this land, the line between those two things was paper thin. I stepped outside into the brittle morning, the snow crust cracking under my boots. The sky was the color of pewter, low and heavy, and I could feel more snow coming. That meant we needed to move soon before the pass closed, and we were trapped here like wolves in a pit. I still had the map I'd taken from the trader's corpse weeks back. And if I was reading it right, there was a settlement 2 days' ride north, a place called Cedar Hollow. Rumors said they had a doctor there, someone who didn't turn away those who couldn't pay. Rumors in the West were like smoke you could grab at them, but your hands would come away empty. But I didn't have the luxury of doubt. When I returned inside, she stirred. Her eyes, too large for her small face, blinked at me in a way that was both trusting and distant, as though she had already learned not to expect much from the world. I told her we were moving, tried to make my voice steady so she wouldn't hear the fear behind it. She didn't answer, but she nodded once, slowly. Packing took less than an hour. I didn't have much to begin with, and most of what I had was worn to the point of breaking. The rifle, the canteen, a small pouch of jerky, and the blanket I'd wrapped around her. I lifted her into the saddle, then mounted behind her, the weight of her slight frame pressing into me. The mare's breath steamed in the cold, her hooves crunching through the thin ice that had formed overnight. We followed the narrow trail through the pines, the silence broken only by the occasional snap of a branch under snow. My mind kept drifting to the possibility of an ambush. Men like the ones from the saloon didn't lose interest easily, and if they'd caught wind of which way we'd gone, they could be anywhere. I'd learned long ago that danger didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waited patiently, like a snake in the grass, until you stepped close enough for it to strike. By midday, the wind picked up, throwing white powder into our faces and blurring the trail ahead. I could feel Little Sparrow shivering against me, so I pulled my coat tighter around her. The storm was coming faster than I'd thought, and if we didn't find shelter soon, the cold would take her before sickness did. My eyes scanned the tree line for any break, any sign of rock overhang or cave. That was when I saw it, a dark slash against the whiteness, half hidden by snowdrift. It turned out to be an abandoned trapper's cabin, smaller than the one we'd left behind, with a roof sagging under the weight of years. Still, it was 4 walls and a place to block the wind, and that was enough. I dismounted, carried her inside, and set her down in the corner where the boards looked least likely to give way. There was no wood left, but I managed to break apart part of the rotting door frame to start a fire. It smoked more than it burned, but even smoke was better than the breath of the storm outside. As night fell, I thought about Cedar Hollow and the miles still ahead. I thought about the old man and the look in his eyes when he realized his time had run out. And I thought about the men who might be following, their patience sharpening into something lethal. Out here, survival was never just about endurance. It was about staying a step ahead of the ones who wanted what you had. And right now, what I had was a dying child and a promise I couldn't break. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time the wind howled, I reached for the rifle. Every time she coughed, I felt my chest tighten. The West had a way of stripping you down to the truth of who you were, and mine was simple enough. I was a man with nothing left to lose except her, and that was enough to make me dangerous. The night after we left the sheriff's station, the desert felt colder than I remembered. The moon hung low over the horizon, a dull, pale lantern that barely pierced the shadows stretching across the sand. Every sound carried our horses' hooves, the dry creak of saddle leather, even the faint rattle of my own breathing. I had the feeling that every eye in that wasteland was on us, waiting for a wrong move. I kept looking at the old blanket draped over my horse's flank. Inside, bundled tight, was the medicine I had bled and begged to get. Not for me, not for anyone I loved, but for a child I'd only seen once, in the arms of a desperate man who had been treated like dirt by the same town that claimed to be civilized. The irony was bitter in my mouth. I had risked my neck for something that wasn't even mine, and yet it felt like it was. Samuel rode ahead, his frame stiff, eyes scanning the ridgelines. He'd barely spoken since the sheriff's office. I knew what was eating at him. It wasn't fear, it was the weight of what we had done. The sheriff's men would be coming. Not because we'd broken any law, but because we'd broken their order. And in this land, breaking their order was worse than theft, worse than bloodshed. We passed a dried riverbed, the sand inside littered with cracked animal bones. I wondered if that was what they wanted for the old man and his grandson, to let them dry out under the sun until nothing was left but something to step over. The thought tightened my hands around the reins. When we finally made camp, Samuel knelt by the fireless circle of stones and started talking low, almost to himself. "They'll track us," he said. "Maybe not tonight. Maybe not tomorrow, but they'll come. And when they do, it won't just be for you or me. They'll make an example out of the old man, out of the kid, out of anyone who stood too close." I stared at the coals that weren't there. "Then we keep moving." "That's not a plan," he said. "It's the only one we've got." For a while, the only sound was the wind whistling through the brittle brush. My mind kept flashing back to that day in the street, when I first saw the old man being shoved aside like he was less than an animal. That moment had set this whole thing in motion, like a stone dropped into water that kept making bigger and bigger ripples. We traveled through the dark until our horses began to stumble. By dawn, the land had shifted low, rolling hills giving way to jagged stone outcrops. From here, you could see for miles in every direction. That was both a blessing and a curse. You saw trouble coming, but trouble saw you too. By midday, the sun was a hammer on the back of my neck. We reached a narrow pass and stopped. It was here, Samuel said, that he had once seen a band of hired gunmen lay in ambush. If the sheriff wanted us, this was where they'd try to pin us. I swallowed hard. The medicine weighed heavy in my saddlebag, not in pounds, but in consequence. We moved slow through the pass, every shadow looking like it might spit lead. My nerves were strung so tight, I thought I might shatter if a bird took flight. Halfway through, I spotted them 3 figures on the ridge, rifles in hand. The glint of the sun on their barrels told me they weren't here for sightseeing. Samuel didn't need to say a word. We kicked our horses forward, the sound of gunfire cracking like thunder behind us. Bullets tore into the stone, splintering it into shards that stung my face. The pass narrowed, funneling us toward the only exit, and that was exactly what they wanted. We broke through the mouth of the pass in a blur of dust and shouting. One of the riders dropped in behind us, his horse eating the distance. I twisted in the saddle, pulled my revolver, and fired. Missed. Fired again. This time he pitched sideways and vanished from the saddle, his horse veering off. But there were more. Always more. By the time we shook them, my horse was trembling, foam dripping from its mouth. Samuel's arm was bleeding from a graze, and my own hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the reins steady. We didn't stop until the horizon was nothing but flat desert again. When we finally slid off our horses, I thought about the old man, about the boy, and I realized the ugly truth: this wasn't going to end when we handed over the medicine. Not for them, not for us. The sheriff's reach was long, and men like him didn't forget. As we made camp, Samuel finally looked at me, his eyes hard. "We need to decide," he said. "Are we just delivering this, or are we ending this?" I didn't answer right away, because deep down, I knew he wasn't asking about the medicine. He was asking if we were ready to burn the whole damn thing down. The sun rose slow that morning, its light dragging itself across the mountains like a tired traveler who had seen too much. I felt the weight of that day before it had even begun. The air had a certain heaviness, a silence broken only by the faint rattle of wind through the brittle grass and the far-off cry of a crow. I had slept little the night before, my mind circling like a vulture over everything that had happened. Faces came to me in the dark, hungry faces, desperate faces, faces of the dead, and somewhere in that endless procession was the hollow-eyed stare of the native man, his voice still echoing from the day I first saw him beg for help. It felt like years had passed since that moment, though in truth it was only months. Months in which I had crossed miles of empty land, buried friends and enemies, and watched blood soak into the same soil that once grew wheat and wildflowers. I had learned that the land here did not forgive easily, and neither did men. By the time I stepped outside, the camp was already stirring. The fire was low, its embers snapping faintly. Jack was sharpening his knife, his face expressionless, but I could tell he hadn't slept much either. He looked up at me briefly, then went back to his work, the rasp of steel on stone marking the quiet rhythm of the morning. We had come a long way from being strangers thrown together by circumstance. Now we were bound by something heavier, by the kind of understanding that only comes from standing side by side when the bullets are flying and the world is burning down around you. Still, there was a tension between us. Not mistrust exactly, but the awareness that both of us had our own reasons for seeing this thing through, and they weren't entirely the same. The plan was simple in words and impossible in execution. Ride to Redford by nightfall, cut through the south side of town where the law kept a lighter watch, and reach the boarding house where we believed the girl was being kept. From there, it would be chaos. No one was under the illusion that we'd get out clean. By midday, we were riding hard. The land here stretched wide, an ocean of pale grass swaying in the wind. Every so often, a hawk would circle overhead, its shadow slipping across the ground like a warning. I could feel the weight of my revolver at my hip, the smooth wooden handle worn down by days of use. My rifle rested across my saddle, oiled and ready, but weapons alone didn't comfort me. You could be armed to the teeth out here and still find yourself buried by sundown. When Redford finally came into view, it looked almost peaceful in the afternoon light. False peace, the kind that hides knives in the shadows. The town was a cluster of sun-bleached buildings huddled together against the wind, their edges sharp against the rolling plains. A church steeple rose above them like a watchful eye, its bells silent. I could see the dust of the main street drifting lazily between the saloon and the general store. We waited in a gully just outside town, hidden among the scrub brush. Jack passed me a canteen and spoke in a low voice. "Once we're in, we don't stop, no matter what." I nodded. The truth was, I had no illusions about what was coming. There would be gunfire, maybe flames. People would die. The only question was who and whether we'd live to see the next dawn. The streets were quieter than I expected as we entered from the south. A few men leaned against the rail outside the saloon, spitting tobacco into the dust. They watched us but didn't move. That told me two things. They knew we were outsiders, and they didn't want trouble unless trouble came looking for them. Unfortunately, we were trouble. We rode straight to the boarding house, a two-story building with peeling white paint and curtains drawn tight over every window. The front door creaked as we stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of stale tobacco and cheap perfume. The woman at the desk looked up, her face hard and suspicious. She started to speak, but I cut her off, my voice low and steady. "We're here for the girl." Something flickered in her eyes, fear, or maybe calculation, but she didn't move. Instead, a man emerged from the back room, tall and broad-shouldered, his coat pulled back to show the gleam of a revolver. He didn't speak either. He just stared at us like he was measuring the distance to our graves. That's when everything broke. The first shot came from upstairs, shattering the silence like glass. Jack dove for cover behind the desk as the big man drew, his gun hand fast but not fast enough. My bullet caught him in the chest and he went down hard, knocking over a chair. Footsteps thundered above us, and I knew we had only seconds. I ran for the stairs, my boots hammering the wood, my rifle clutched tight. A door at the end of the hall burst open and two men came out firing. The air filled with a deafening crack of gunfire, the acrid sting of powder smoke burning my throat. One of them dropped under my shot. The other kept coming until Jack's bullets spun him into the wall. We found her in the last room, pale, thin, her eyes wide with terror but still alive. She looked at me like she recognized me, though I couldn't imagine how. Maybe it was just that I looked like someone who'd come too late too many times. There was no time for words. We pulled her to her feet and made for the stairs. But outside, the street was alive with shouting and the heavy drum of boots on wood. Redford had woken, and it was waking angry. The three of us bolted down the alley, bullets tearing into the walls around us, splinters flying. A horse whinnied in panic somewhere close. Jack went ahead to ready the mounts while I covered our retreat, firing into the shapes that moved in the swirling dust. My heart was a hammer in my chest, but my hands were steady. We rode hard out of town, the wind in our faces, the sound of pursuit fading behind us. I didn't know where we were heading, only that it was away from Redford, away from the walls closing in. But as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gold, I knew one thing for certain: the reckoning wasn't over. It was only just beginning. I'd always thought the West was nothing more than an endless horizon of dust, blood, and broken men. But that night, standing in the middle of Hollow Creek, I understood it was more than that. It was a place where the measure of a soul was weighed, not by how much it owned, but by what it was willing to lose. The town was silent when I rode in. No children playing, no old men sitting outside the saloon, not even the wind through the broken shutters. It felt like Hollow Creek was holding its breath, waiting to see if the devil himself was about to walk down Main Street. Maybe it wasn't wrong. The moon hung low, casting a pale light over the gallows the townsfolk had built in the square. They'd been fast about it, too fast. And standing beneath the noose, hands bound, was Little Crow. His face was swollen, split in places from the blows he'd taken. But his eyes were steady. He wasn't afraid. He was ready. The sheriff stood beside him, reading charges written on a piece of paper that meant nothing. They'd decided the ending long before the trial began. Men with rifles lined the rooftops, their silhouettes jagged against the moonlight. This wasn't justice. It was a killing dressed up to look clean. I slid off my horse, my boots hitting the dirt like the crack of a whip. Every pair of eyes in the square turned toward me, but no one spoke. I walked slowly, each step heavy with the weight of what I'd come to do. "You got no place here, boy," the sheriff called out, though his voice lacked the conviction of a man in control. "Turn around and maybe you live to see another sunrise." I didn't answer. My gaze was fixed on Little Crow. He gave the smallest shake of his head, telling me not to risk it, but it was too late for warnings. I stopped just short of the gallows. "If you're gonna hang a man," I said, my voice carrying in the still night, "you'd best make sure he's guilty." A murmur ran through the crowd. The sheriff's jaw tightened. "He killed a rancher in cold blood. That's guilt enough for me." "That rancher," I said, was the same man who left Little Crow's granddaughter to die in the snow. You call it murder. I call it justice finally catching up. I could see the uncertainty ripple through some of the faces in the crowd. Not everyone here was blind to the truth. They were just too afraid to speak it. The sheriff stepped down from the gallows, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. You think you can come here, stir up trouble, and ride out alive? This town ain't yours to save. I met his stare. Maybe not, but it ain't yours to damn either. The moment hung between us, brittle as dry tinder. Then the sheriff went for his gun. I don't remember deciding to draw. My hand just moved. The sound of my Colt was deafening in the stillness. One shot, then another. The sheriff's body jerked, stumbled, and crumpled into the dust. The rifles on the rooftops barked, but I was already moving. Bullets tore splinters from the wooden posts and sent sparks skittering off the stone well. Townsfolk scattered, screaming. I reached the gallows, slashing the rope from around Little Crow's neck with a single pull of my knife. Go! I shouted. We ran, diving for cover behind the water trough. Little Crow's breathing was ragged, but his eyes burned with the fire of a man who wasn't ready to be buried yet. Gunfire chased us down the alley, echoing off the clapboard walls. My shoulder burned where a bullet had grazed me, but I didn't slow. We burst into the open plains beyond the last row of buildings, the moonlight spilling silver across the grass. My horse waited where I'd left him. We mounted in one motion, and the stallion lunged forward, hooves drumming against the earth. Behind us, the shouting grew faint. No one in Hollow Creek had the stomach to chase us into the night. We rode until the sky began to pale with the first light of dawn. When we finally stopped, it was on a ridge overlooking miles of untouched land. The kind of place where a man could almost believe the world was still good. Little Crow dismounted slowly, his legs unsteady. He looked at me for a long time before speaking. You risked your life for mine. Why? I didn't have an easy answer. Maybe it was because I'd seen too much wrong go unpunished. Maybe it was because I was tired of burying good people while the bad ones prospered. Or maybe, deep down, I just couldn't stand the thought of riding into another sunrise knowing I'd done nothing. I guess, I said finally, because someone should have done it for me once. He nodded, as if he understood more than I'd said. Then he looked toward the horizon, where the sun was breaking over the land in a blaze of gold. The West takes much, he said quietly, but sometimes it gives something back. We stood there until the sun was fully risen. Two men bound by blood neither of us had spilled, but both of us had carried. And as the wind swept across the ridge, I realized the West wasn't just dust, blood, and broken men. It was also the place where a man could choose just once not to be broken. If you were in the main character's shoes, would you have fought the same battle? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like this video. And now, explore the other stories waiting for you on the screen.